right, let's get started. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the February 3rd Thursday Web Forum, our first webinar of 2018. I'm Hillary Morris. I work on Blueprint User Support and Communications for the South Atlantic Blueprint. So we host this Web Forum every third Thursday of the month at 10 a.m. to give folks like you a chance to ask questions and provide input to help guide the conservation future of the South Atlantic region. So here is our agenda for this morning. I'm going to start out by introducing our panel speakers, and then we'll get a 5-minute overview from each panelist on some specific aspects of their partnership. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion with our panelists afterward, and then we'll wrap up with a preview of next month's webinar and an update on all of this LCC transition business from Mallory Martin, our coordinator. So a couple of logistics. I'm really going to try to avoid putting us in silent mode today because we're going to be switching between speakers a lot and trying to have an open discussion. So I'd really appreciate it if you could be very conscientious of putting yourself on mute. And if you have questions during the overview portion, I'm going to be monitoring the chat box, so you're welcome to use that, or you can always hold them until we pause for Q&A. So before I move on to introducing our speakers, does anybody have any questions or comments or concerns? All right, moving right along. Our panelists today include, in no particular order, Jessica Graham with the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership, Bill Crowell with the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership, Jeff Marcus with the North Carolina Sandhills Conservation Partnership, and Aimee Weldon with Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. So as you may know, this is a time of transition for the South Atlantic LCC and the LCC network. So we thought this would be good timing to talk about some best practices from successful partnerships in our region to guide how collaborative landscape scale conservation may evolve in the Southeast. So Jessica, I'm going to ask you to start us off.
Thank you very much. I don't have any slides or anything, so I'm just going to kind of talk about the questions that are up on the screen right now. So for the first one, first I'll go ahead and do a brief overview of SARP. So the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership covers 14 Southeast states. We focus on aquatic resources, any and all, basically. And I'll jump to the second one. Our governing body is from SEFWA, so the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has a board of directors that are composed of the executive directors of each fish and wildlife agency in the Southeast, which is from Texas, Oklahoma, over to the Atlantic seaboard, and includes Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia on the northern side. And so each of the executive directors of those agencies appoint a steering committee representative, and that is completely up to the states. It's generally a position that they appoint, and whoever is in that position fills the need, and they are our governing body. So what works well, what doesn't. With 14 states, and every coastal state gets 2 representatives, it's a large group, and so logistics for a large group is difficult, of course, and keeping engagement across such a large geography is very difficult. But what really, I think, helps power us through and keep us going is that although we have a structure, we were first developed in 2001, formally in 2004, and so our structure exists, but it's not very heavy with bureaucracy. And so it gives a little bit of that flexibility, but we don't get bogged down in the bureaucracy of a large governing group type of thing, which I think really helps us in the Southeast. Some other things is that I think a good thing is we have a very strong connection to the states because of the way we're set up, which I think is a niche that we get to fill, especially we also focus in aquatics, which is an underrepresented group in the Southeast. One downside is that like I said, the directors appoint a position. And so, as we are all familiar, usually there's a lot of turnover in positions, especially with state agencies. And so sometimes you get just a constant turnover of your representatives, and so then you're having to kind of catch up a lot of the times. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges, is to be able to tell them why they need to be at the table, and then when that person leaves, tell the next person why they need to be at the table, that sort of thing. How do we stay afloat? Sometimes I feel like we don't. I think the biggest thing is grants. A lot of lost sleep over writing grants, and then partnerships, because being such a large geography, you can't do everything, but there's a lot of need, and so finding those partnerships where people can fill in the need that you have, and then you're still providing value to them as well, I think is where, you know, you have that sweet spot, and you don't always get it, but you get it. When you do get it, you just can kind of soar. And then forward momentum, again, a lot of the times I don't feel like we have forward momentum. I feel like it's, you know, 3 steps forward, 5 steps back. And you just power through. You just keep going as much as you can and not get discouraged by various things that try to block your path. I think that's it.
Thanks, Jessica. Does anybody have any quick questions for Jessica before we move on to the next presenter? Particular questions about STARP? Okay, well, hearing none, we'll obviously have plenty of time to discuss this as a group after all of our presenters are done, but I'm going to go ahead and pass the presenter power over to Bill Crowell with AppNet. And just a friendly reminder to anybody who's joined us in the last few minutes to please mute your line.
Okay, can you see it?
Sure can.
Okay.
It's all yours.
So I'll get started here. So just a brief background on the program first is that the Albemarle-Pamlico National Estuary Partnership for AppNet was begun in 1987. It was authorized and is funded under the Clean Water Act. Even though it's under the Clean Water Act, it focuses on the system as a whole and not just the water aspects of it. AppNet is one of 28 NEPs around the country. And under the Clean Water Act, each NEP is required of developing a strategic plan for improving and protecting their area, their estuary of national significance. So each program gets something called a CCMP, a Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan. Their terminology, not mine, but in essence, it's a strategic plan, and ours is a 10-year strategic plan. So AppNet also has a mission is to identify, restore, and protect the significant resources of the estuarine system. Notice it doesn't say natural resources, but significant resources. We take an approach where humans are considered part of the environment. So with our mission and our CCMP, which guides our direction, we work with our partners to implement the CCMP. We have a large program area, one of the largest of any of the NEPs, and is the northern portion of the South Atlantic LCC, as you can see. So with regard to our structure, we are, as I mentioned, funded by EPA, but we are hosted by the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. And say host is that they are not to provide direction to our program. We function a little more like a nonprofit in some aspects. We are guided by what is a leadership council, which is considered to be a board, and it is authorized, the whole management conference is authorized by North Carolina's Governor Executive Order number 26, which was put out in November last year. It is the 4th executive order we've had since 1994. So we have Leadership Council that guides the overall direction of the program, a Science and Technical Advisory Committee, an Implementation Advisory Committee that helps us with implementing the CCMP. And then there are teams that help with each aspect below that, and that's where the main work gets done. Those are action teams, monitoring assessment teams, and then other ad hoc things that come up as needed. Most important to us are our partners, and then we have a excellent staff to help guide the process. So on to the resources. I think the thing that is most important to us is our partners. We get very little funding for our program area, and working with our partners to implement projects is key to our success. And I think the key there are the connections that we make among those. Having limited resources is being able to leverage other resources and partners together to implement things that might not otherwise be done. So filling the gap is one of the things that's really important to us, where it fits in with implementing that CCMP. Developing that CCMP was built on trying to identify some of those gaps. So it's really a gap-filling document in many gaps. So trying to move forward is we really focus on our CCMP. It's the guiding direction for us. If we don't stay to that, we get mission drift, and we'll end up doing a lot of things that are not beneficial to our program and our partners. So as I mentioned, filling gaps, one of the things that we try to do is make sure we're all moving in the same direction, that if we have a CCMP action that we want to accomplish, is to find the other partners out there who need something similar or that exact same type of mission accomplished. So by working with them, we can add resources and find other resources and leverage those to accomplishing that task. One of the other things we try to do, even though it's a very complex system to work in and many different actions within the CCMP, is we really try to keep it as simple as possible. That's easier said than done, but trying to work with contracting and a number of other things, the simpler it is, the easier it is to have partners engaged. And I can stop there.
Thanks, Bill. Anybody have any questions for Bill? So does the fact that the North Carolina Environmental Agency is the host, does that mean that most of AppNet's staff are considered employees of that agency?
So all of our employees are state employees. We have a staff of 8 right now. 2 of them are funded by the state, and the others are funded by EPA. So we are federally funded state employees, which means I say we can't talk to any elected official unless they're asking us questions.
Fair enough. Thanks. Any other questions for Bill before I pass things along to Jeff? All right, Jeff, you are up. You have the presenter power. Feel free to take it away.
Okay. See if we can get this to work. Everyone see my screen okay?
Looking good?
Yes.
All right. So I was going to give an overview of the North Carolina Sandhills Conservation Partnership. This is found in the south central portion of North Carolina. And to talk about what makes this partnership tick, I think it's important to first understand kind of how it came together. And that it was really born in conflict in the late 80s, early 90s, when the federally endangered red-cockaded woodpecker was in trouble, and the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a jeopardy opinion against Fort Bragg, the big military training installation for the Army in the Sandhills, that restricted training activities, and there was a lot of upset from the Army, from local citizens, kind of epitomized by this image in the local paper at the time in 1990, red-cockaded woodpecker with a bullseye target published on the front of it, sort of captured the mood at that time. This partnership, or this situation, could have gone the way of a lot of environmental conflicts, and I probably wouldn't be talking to you today about the success in the Sandhills, except for some forward-thinking people that decided, all right, we got more to gain by working together to solve the underlying problem instead of fighting about how do we, deal with the consequences of it, to bring out a spirit of more collaboration with some perhaps at the time unusual seeming partners, as epitomized by this political cartoon that appeared in the paper in 2002, illustrating the shift to collaboration from those initial days of conflict. As you can imagine from those beginnings, the focus of this group at the first was very much on recovering populations of red-cockaded woodpeckers, and that was the primary focus as this partnership has evolved, things have gone on, is definitely expanded to include a kind of a broader suite of ecosystem protection and management type of goals. The structure of this group, there's no one practically no one that's a dedicated employee of the partnership. Everyone, it's the individual partners who are doing this on top of, in addition to their day job. Susan Miller, who's on the call, helps to run the steering committee, which is our decision-making body that meets quarterly. These meetings function more like really an information sharing forum meeting than a true like business meeting of steering committee. It's where all the partners come together. And then there's work groups that meet as needed to focus on land protection, habitat management, what we call reserve design, doing conservation data, and woodpecker recovery group, and a communications group. So some of the outputs, what does this group actually produce or do? One key thing is both compiling and producing original habitat and species data. So this is taking information from our Natural Heritage Program and some original data sets that are collected here in the Sandhills, put together in one place, which is used to inform land acquisition, our land management activities. The data are shared with local governments for land use and land use planning. So that's one key output is to be able to kind of share where are the conservation priorities for the region. There's a conservation plan and a monitoring plan that helps guide some of our work. I put information sharing here as an output. It doesn't seem like that much, but really that's a big key function is that you're taking a lot of disparate partners and bringing them together so they all know what they're doing, what each other is doing, and it helps to avoid duplication of effort and missing opportunities. And then finally, really kind of where the rubber meets the road is where the partnership is able to leverage, better collaboration among partners. So when it comes to military training issues that pop up or forestry issues, there's a forum mechanism to work through some of those things. There's a MOU between various state partners and the Nature Conservancy for controlled burning that allows us to help each other with burning on each other's land, and that has led to great sharing of resources, epitomized this picture here by our shared burn crew, where TNC hires a very skilled prescribed burn crew that burns not just on TNC preserves, but on game lands, on state parks, and on other partner properties. So what has this group accomplished since it was formed in 2000? So this, among the work that happened, actually some of it preceding the formal partnership, but created the first in the nation Army Compatible Use Buffer Cooperative Agreement, something that's now been replicated at military installations across the country. The Safe Harbor Program that the Fish and Wildlife Service developed was created here in the Sandhills, again, something that's now been expanded nationwide to deal with endangered species on private lands. There's been over 30,000 acres protected, pulled in over $80 million worth of funding for land protection and land management activities from a variety of different sources. And one of the key things you mentioned that, the woodpecker populations and easing training restrictions was a big focus. Well, that population goal for the woodpecker was reached in 2016, which did lead to an easing of many military training restrictions. And just recently in 2017, I've accomplished basically establishing demographic connectivity between the eastern and western subpopulations of the birds in the Sandhills. So a few of the highlights of accomplishments. I want to talk about how the partnership brings in resources to stay afloat. That first bullet I put in the biggest font, because that's really been the big dog here, is the Army funding for endangered species recovery. That is what has driven much of the sort of political impetus as well as the financial thrust behind the work that this partnership has done, and without it there wouldn't have been as much. So that's something that's maybe unique to a certain number of situations, not as easily exportable elsewhere, but that's what has been a big driver for the North Carolina Sandhills. Next, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. There's specifically their Longleaf Stewardship Fund. We've had a great success in pulling in funds to fund both resource management on conservation lands as well as private land effort to start up a prescribed burn association among private landowners. Talk here about next the partners. So again, each individual organization, sends their own people that commit their time and their resources. It's basically a collection of organizations doing their own work, but in a way that where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So that is part of the resources, is all the individual organizations that come bring that to the table. I think one of the previous presenters mentioned about the importance of sort of when there's turnover, of making sure that the next person knows what the heck is going on, and you don't have a big drop off. And there has been a conscious effort to continue to engage partners, bring along that next generation. An example is that when Partnership celebrated its 10-year anniversary back in 2010, there was a big effort to sort of interview all the individual stakeholders, find out what's working, what's not, kind of revisit the success of the partnership. And there has been a turnover from the original founders of this group. There's a new generation for the most part who's in there, and still a lot of positive momentum. And the final point that I have here is that some of that funding that, again, originated through the Army and through other sources have paid for a fellowship position through the Oak Ridge Institute, where we hire an ORISE fellow. That part of their job is dedicated to supporting this partnership with pulling together, taking meeting minutes and getting information from the different work groups and helping with the monitoring plan and other implementation. So that's been a big benefit to us to have a position that has some time dedicated specifically to the partnership. All right, so what works well and what doesn't? Big thing is the focus on overlapping priorities. Obviously, the military has a lot of interests that don't have anything to do, that aren't the same with the interests of TNC or the interests of the Wildlife Resource Commission or Fish and Wildlife and other partners, but it's the focus on the overlapping interests where we've been able to really make the contrast and focus on what we have in common, not what kind of separates us. Making the meetings generally a worthwhile use of people's time. There's good information that's exchanged there. A lot of good people keep coming to the table, and so folks find that worthwhile. That's important. There's buy-in both from sort of the upper levels of a lot of these organizations to be involved in the partnership, as well as the field staff seeing value. So that's been important to have buy-in at both those levels. What's been important is it seemed to gather a lot of people willing to think of new ways to solve problems. When Safe Harbor was initially proposed, a lot of people say, you're crazy, that's a dumb idea. The cooperative agreement between the Army, a lot of these things where we're sort of really thinking outside the box, but have demonstrated success and being willing to take those kind of risks. Really, nothing breeds success better than success. And so showing results, getting RCW recovery, getting land protected, getting more, fire on the ground, results is really what keeps this thing effective. And then finally, it's all about relationships. It took, a leap of faith and some trust from folks from the Army, folks from Fish and Wildlife and other partners to come together initially. And that spirit has been continued. That trust and the relationships has been key. In terms of things, what doesn't work, I tried to come up with some examples. There have been instances when one partner or some of the people in the group raise an issue, concern about how another partner is managing their land or something they're doing that other people don't like. We try to be very careful about that. We're not an organization that's out to tell, member things, what to do or what not to do. This is a way to sort of share information and try and encourage, better decision making, but not about forcing others to do one thing or another. And then, even though we've had good active involvement from a lot of the partners that are there, I feel like we've maybe fallen short in the potential that we could have from having more active involvement from some partners like NRCS, some of the local governments, North Carolina Department of Transportation. These have all been involved to some extent, but I think there's still some meat left on the bone with what they can do, with them. Maintaining forward momentum. One thing, we've started to become a victim of our own success, that as the woodpecker has reached population goals and Army restrictions are lifted, a lot of that initial push from the Army to fund our work is now being sort of alleviated, and so they want to put their money elsewhere. So we need to be willing to be innovative and change and shift as the dynamic on the ground shifts. And the bottom line, as I kind of mentioned before, that participating in that partnership needs to be more of a worthwhile use of people's time than not participating. That, whatever those folks are looking at that pond there needs to be more interesting to them than that stack of emails that are piling up in their office when they're taking the time to be out doing this. So just making it continue to be a worthwhile use of people's time. And that's what I got.
Thanks, Jeff. Great success stories in there. Anyone have any super fast questions for Jeff before we move on to our last presenter? All right, hearing none, hand it off to Aimee Weldon with the ACJV. Take it away, Aimee.
All right. Can you all see the screen?
Sure can.
Okay, great. So my name's Aimee, and I coordinate the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. And I'm pretty sure most of you have probably heard of joint ventures, but just in a nutshell, they're cooperative regional partnerships that have a mission of conserving habitat for birds. There's about 22 of them that span almost the entire country and into Canada and Mexico as well. The Atlantic Coast Joint Venture has kind of gone through an evolution as a partnership. We have gone from focusing on all birds. One of the things that the joint ventures are usually tasked with doing is implementing the various bird conservation plans that are out there. And there's a lot of them, and they cover all types of birds. So there's the Partners in Flight Plan, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, the Waterbird Conservation Plan, and there's regional plans. And the joint ventures are usually identified as the entity that is to implement those plans. But obviously, that's an impossible task. You can't do all of that work and do all of that conservation for all of these species with the amount of staff and resources that we have. And so our joint venture decided to take a little bit of a more strategic approach to bird conservation and decided that we could really move the needle on conservation if we took the focus off of trying to do everything and moved it toward trying to do just a few things. So we moved from doing all birds and all habitats over the last year and a half to making a decision to narrow that down to just 3 birds and 1 general habitat. So our current focus as a partnership is on coastal marshes, which is largely focused on salt marshes, but also some of the tidal marshes that are fresh and other similar habitats. And then 3 birds that kind of collectively represent those habitats across our geographic scope from Maine all the way down to Puerto Rico. And this has actually been one of the most successful things that we have done as a partnership. It has brought in a lot more support and resources to our partnership because we have that focus, and because we have that focus, we can set really easily measurable objectives. We have population and habitat objectives for each of our 3 species. We're developing tools that identify where the highest priority habitats are for each of those species, and those tools are being used and shared with our partners. We're developing conservation plans that are focused on these species. We're tying these things into coastal resiliency efforts that benefit communities that don't specifically focus on wildlife. So it's been a very good move for us, even though there was a lot of growing pains in kind of taking the partnership from everything to these small subset that tends to obviously leaves some people out and a lot of birds and habitats out. In terms of our structure, this is the green area is the geographic region of the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture. So it's a pretty big partnership. It's 16 states and the territory of Puerto Rico. We're governed by a management board that represents the directors of each of the state wildlife agencies in this region, as well as people at the director level of some of the big NGOs like Ducks Unlimited, the Nature Conservancy, and other federal agencies like the Park Service and NRCS, and of course other representatives of Fish and Wildlife Service. And so they kind of direct and guide the partnership and make the decisions on where the overall focus of the partnership should be. And then those same partner entities are also represented at the technical level. So we have a technical committee that includes technical folks at each of those agencies and those organizations. And they're who kind of provide the technical support and help us develop our models and our conservation plans and population objectives and things. And then that's all done through working groups, which we've established 1 working group for each of our flagship species, black rail, black duck, and salt marsh sparrow. And those working groups aren't restricted to just the people who serve on the technical committee. We also bring in outside experts from academia and others who maybe represent the entities on our joint venture management board, but aren't the actual person who's serving. And so we want to make sure that we bring in the expertise that we need to answer the questions that we have. And so overall, this structure, I think, really it has a lot of benefits for sure, because we have that partner buy-in. There's a lot of engagement because collectively the management board decided through a very extensive, many months process that this is going to be our focus and that we are all going to champion this focus. And so that's been really, really positive and beneficial because it's brought in more resources and support for doing this kind of work. And then that, of course, feeds down to the technical level, and they're doing that work as well. I think several of the presenters have mentioned turnover as a challenge, and that's certainly a challenge with us. I know that we went through a lot of effort to get people on board with this new focus, and then since then, about 3/4 of those people have turned over. So you kind of have to start over and over again. So that's always a challenge. But for the most part, this structure really does work well for us. How we stay afloat. We're fortunate in that we're funded through federal appropriations. So we do have this kind of base level of funding that provides funding for the five staff and a contractor that we have permanently on board for the joint venture through the Fish and Wildlife Service, and then all of the costs associated with that. Things, of course, are leaner now and uncertain, and at any moment our line item could be eliminated, so that's always a concern. But so far, the joint ventures have been pretty well supported by Congress. We also try to bring in grant funding for individual projects, so that this has been a lot easier lately because we have our focus, and so we've been able to bring in several grants in the Chesapeake Bay region, specifically to focus on black duck and various aspects of black duck, because we have that focus. So that's been a real boon to us, is to be able to say, like, this is who we are, this is our identity, this is why it's important, and please continue to fund us for these reasons. And it does continue to bring in more funds because we're able to deliver. And then also the management board has set up a funding mechanism that allows the joint venture staff to come to the management board with ideas of bigger projects that benefit a lot of the states or the members of the joint venture partnership. And the management board will then vote and decide whether they want to collectively pool their resources to fund those projects. So that's another way that we have been able to bring in some funding to benefit our flagship efforts. Maintaining momentum. I think one of the most important things has been maintaining this strategic focus. Like, people know who we are, they know what we do, they know what species we focus on, so they know to come to us when opportunities arise. So that's been a real positive for us. And also making sure that we're adding value and developing products that inform the larger conservation at a regional level. So it doesn't make sense for the joint venture to be, focusing on a local scale project. We really want to try to play that coordination and facilitation role that brings multiple states or regions together in doing coordinated conservation. And that's something that is adding value because those states themselves are usually confined to their state board boundaries. So we are adding value by working with those states to coordinate those same efforts on a larger scale and get more conservation done. So that's what I mean by the right role at the right scale. And always delivering and making measurable progress always maintains momentum. I think several of the presenters have already said that success begets success. The more we're able to show that we're effective and innovative and doing good work, the more momentum that we can maintain. And partners are pretty key. Our success hinges entirely on our partners. And without them, we would not be able to do very much just as our subset of staff. And so always making sure that those partners are engaged and satisfied with the direction that we're going is pretty crucial to keeping us moving forward. And that's all I've got.
Thanks, Aimee. Any questions specific to the joint venture for Aimee? All right, so we just kind of want to open this up to a group discussion where if you have particular questions for a member of the panel or for the panel more broadly, just please feel free to jump in. You're welcome to unmute your line. We have one question in the chat box from Greg Wathen that I'll go ahead and kick us off with. You should be able to read that in the chat if you want to follow along. So AFWA has formed a working group in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service to examine landscape conservation partnerships and look at the challenges and successes of landscape conservation. And this was established in part to address this ongoing transition of LCCs within the Department of Interior and Fish and Wildlife Service. So do any of you on the panel have any thoughts or recommendations on how landscape partnerships should be moving forward in the future, particularly any thoughts on geographic scale or governance structure? Initially, I was tempted to target maybe Jessica or Aimee on this, working at a large scale. But I actually think a small, a perspective of a smaller partnership would also be very valuable. So any of you that want to weigh in on this, please feel free.
I'll take a stab, I guess. This is Aimee. I would say that one of the things that's really important is making sure that the partnership is filling a gap, and that's a gap that's identified to be of importance to the larger conservation community. This is something that our joint venture has gone through and had to invest a lot of time and resources into determining that this really is the right thing to do, and people actually are demanding this and they want this, so that when your partnership comes online, people know that you're doing something that is needed. And so I think really taking the time to figure out what that gap is and to figure out how you can best fill it is pretty essential so that you can hit the ground running.
All right, so getting very specific about the niche that landscape partnership would be filling.
And that's a niche that the larger conservation community want to see filled.
Great.
Yeah, this is Bill. I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and that then relates to the scale. Depending on what it is your focus is and what your mission is or your task, then your scale should be appropriate to that.
Yeah, this is Jessica, and I agree as well. I mean, the scale depends on your objectives, and your objectives depend on what you're trying to do in your niche. So there's not really a recommendation until you do go through that exercise of figuring out what is the niche and who wants it filled and how much they're going to buy into it. And as far as the organizational governance structure part of it, it just depends. And it can go where you really do need a lot of structure and kind of over bureaucracy part of it just to keep things not going outside of that niche and not going outside of the geography or setting. Or, like for SARP, it really helps because we have that set geography, and it helps for me to not have that overarching, structure of, well, I can't answer this question. I have to go talk to this person and this person. And a lot of that is the way we're structured, but then also the level of trust that the steering committee puts in my abilities to be able to represent their perspectives.
So this is Bill. I'm going to go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, I was just going to kind of tag on to those thoughts about scale, which really, for me, that's kind of the biggest challenge when talking about a landscape scale partnership, because just a lot of the things that many of our conservation organizations are used to doing to affect change are buying a piece of land, managing, burning, doing some tangible habitat management, which invariably are things that happen at a certain sort of preserve type property level scale, and then how to find those types of actions that will actually ramp up to either collectively have enough of those kinds of things going on, or to be able to actually influence policy kinds of things that can impact the broader scale. That's the challenge. It seems like there's fewer levers and fewer things that we're good at and that we know how to do that can affect habitat across multi-states compared to what we can do to influence habitat on this particular property.
Sure, good point, Jeff.
So this is Bill. I was going to mention the structure. So I mentioned that APNEP is hosted here by regulatory agency within state government. Within the 28 NEPs, other NEPs are either nonprofits. They're housed in academic institutions. Some are one's housed still in federal government, and then a few are independent governmental agencies. For us, what we have found now that we have our new CCMP and the tasks we have before us and our limited budget, we see that being housed in a regulatory agency is somewhat limiting. It limits our ability to raise funds beyond federal and state, governmental funds or something like a NIFWIF grant. We can't take money from certain foundations or businesses, and it limits our partnerships in being able to do that. So depending on what the task is and what the outcome is anticipated, that should also dictate somewhat structures most beneficial to the program.
Sure, that's a really good point, keeping those constraints in mind of whatever your host agency would be. If you had a business model you thought that you were going to really be relying on grants or those kind of public-private partnerships. So thanks for the discussion on that. Do we have any other questions for the panel?
Hey, Jessica, Hillary, this is Greg Watson.
Okay.
I want to follow up with that question and discussion. You guys, do you all see a path forward for the next evolution of LCCs and what that might look like? And I think that's the impetus of the APWA working group is to sort of try to figure that out. I agree that these scale issues are really important, and we've certainly dealt with scale in my LCC with 10 states and 180 million acres is really challenging to deal with that kind of thing. But is there an overarching structure that could be developed or established that might be helpful to your partnerships, so to speak?
Any takers on that panel?
So this is Jessica. I'll take a stab. It's not going to probably answer and give you the answers you want, but I think it's important to take a step back and figure out what wasn't working with the different LCCs and why those reasons are. Because my experience with the, 7 to 9 LCCs in the Southeast is they're all very different, and so what may have worked for one won't work for another, and so understanding that aspect I think is critical before moving forward. And knowing, not everyone's going to be happy. So if this forms a separate group that looks different than LCCs have, finding that niche and sticking with it, and not trying to, make everyone happy and change anything that you're trying to do. I know one thing that, STARP doesn't have the capacity really to do the hardcore science and condition assessments that the LCCs brought to the table. And so, having that go away is kind of a bummer, for sure. And so I think that that's a niche that I'm not really sure of anyone else really filling right now, and especially in terms of aquatics. So I would take that step back on every single LCC and figure out, what was working and what wasn't working, looking at the mission that you had to begin with, and then moving from there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jessica. And I think the science capacity is one of those areas where I think LCC sort of shined, and so I agree with you. We're trying to figure out how to maintain that in some form.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
that would be good.
Anyone else have thoughts on Greg's follow-up question?
Hey, this is Jeff. And one of the things that struck me that when the LCC concept was first being put in place and was sort of first being looked at, it seemed like a large component of it was doing conservation planning. We need to, put better plans in place at these bigger scales and, identify the priorities. And I feel like it's definitely at a point where a lot of these partnerships have done a lot of conservation planning, and the sort of the need that's out there is less about, better information about where the resources are and or where the, priorities are, and really more resources to implement what has worked well. So I guess that would be my one suggestion is that, as you're going into it, don't feel like necessarily, it's obviously going to vary depending on where and what you're working on, but feeling like, what we need is a better plan may not be the case. Find a niche, find a gap, find something that can bring value and leverage, and focus on that, and don't try and be everything to everyone.
This is Aimee. I could not agree with that more. I think that's absolutely important. One of the notes I'd made to myself before this call was thinking about the long term and not just kind of that first set of products that informs the long term. It's always, in my experience, I've done a lot of conservation planning through my various jobs along my career path, and it's really easy to get money to create and support to create those products because everyone seems to want them. But it's really difficult to find the support and the resources to implement what is laid out in those products, either, plans or maps or what have you. And I think that's a huge gap out there that needs an entity to help fill it, is the implementation gap, and how to make implementation easier, how to make it happen, how to bring in the resources to do that. I don't have the answer, but that's a big gap. I think that everyone would agree needs more support and capacity.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the niches that the South Atlantic was really trying to fill, with the emphasis on user support and all of the different projects in the air that the staff were empowered to work on, and are empowered to work on, to help get the blueprint implemented and help partners bring in money to get that done and get projects on the ground. That's emphasizing that further in the future, and perhaps more broadly across landscape conservation partnerships, whatever form they take, seems like very good advice. All right, any new questions? Chat box is quiet, but we've got probably another 5 minutes for discussion here. This has been fabulous, so this is your chance. All right, well, hearing none, I'm going to go ahead and preview the next web forum and give Mallory a little time to talk about this LCC transition, and then we can come back to our panel at the end if you have a question that kind of percolates to the top here. So let me go back to my slide deck very quickly. So next month, we're going to be back here, same time, same place, March 15th. With a little bit more of a traditional format. We're going to be hearing from Ann Chazelle with the Virginia Natural Heritage Program and John Edding with Florida Natural Areas Inventory about the results of a South Atlantic LCC-funded project to integrate at-risk and range-restricted species models and strategic conservation information into the blueprint. So they presented in June of last year to give us kind of an interim update on this project, so it'll be really great to hear what they have to say about the outcomes. In a nutshell, they've been developing species distribution models for 10 rare species of herps and plants in particular. So drawing from the model products of these species distribution models and other data sets, they've been developing and synthesizing supporting information on the conservation and management needs of these species. So they're going to give kind of an overview of their methods and final products next month. All right, Mallory, the floor is yours. Mallory's going to share an update on this kind of transitional time for LCCs.
Okay, good. Thank you for that, Hillary. And thanks to all of the presenters this morning. I think there was some really interesting common themes and interesting points that were brought up, particularly in that last discussion. And kind of this understanding of what is the niche and who is operating in what specific type of niche. And I think as we look to the future, that's really an important consideration to keep foremost. And I don't have a lot of certainty to apply to our future, but maybe I can outline for you a little bit of the dynamic landscape that we're operating under, and the reasons that landscape has generated a lot of questions about the future of LCCs, both generally across the country and for the South Atlantic specifically. And, part of that stems from the recognition that the Fish and Wildlife Service is not providing dedicated funding for staff support for the LCC steering committees and for the operations of LCCs any longer. So that requires that in the Southeast, that the Science Applications Group, which is what the LCC staff of Fish and Wildlife Service operates within, will be transitioning to a modified role. And what that role exactly will be and what will be the appropriate focus or the niche, as the discussion has been brought up today, what that will be is still a little bit under development. We do know that currently we're be focusing on Fish and Wildlife Service priorities and science needs internal to the agency, and then external to state priorities where those overlap. And so in making this transition and working toward this modified role, we're working on an action plan, and that action plan will help identify how we allocate our staff capacity and resources for the remainder of fiscal year 18 and then beyond. And so within that action plan, we're focusing on 6 major categories of work. And this is being done and planned out at a full Southeast regional scale. So it's similar to the operational scale that Jessica and SARP operates under, which is the southeastern CAFWA states and includes the Caribbean and Puerto Rico. And so the major categories of work we're planning in our action plan will dedicate resources to involve working on at-risk species, working on implementing state wildlife action plans, looking at Gulf restoration and coastal resilience issues, and then broadly collaborative landscape conservation, or LCD, at a very broad scale. And then we've got ongoing projects that require some allocation of our existing capacity for the remainder of this year. Some of those are closeout types of projects. Others are issues that we've been engaged with and will continue to provide advice and support to the extent we can. And then finally, the 6th category is focused on Fish and Wildlife Service science, and primarily the intersection and the support for the USGS cooperative research units at universities, and that partnership among states, universities, USGS, and Fish and Wildlife Service. So there are 6 major categories there that we're focusing this action plan on. We're in the final stages of a draft of that. We hope to have something that we'll share internal to Fish and Wildlife Service with the Southeast Region Directorate team in the coming weeks. Deadline internally for us is 1st of March. Beyond that, we hope to be able to share that action plan more broadly, and then continue to engage with states and internally with Fish and Wildlife Service programs. And as I say that, I'm reminded to point out that this focus doesn't mean that collaborative landscape scale conservation is going away as far as we're concerned. In fact, just the opposite, because fundamental to the Fish and Wildlife Service programmatic priorities and to state Fish and Wildlife Agency priorities is a focus on partnerships. And so we want to continue to fulfill our role as an engager and a convener and a collaborator broadly with organizations such as we heard from today and such as we've been engaged with in the past. So I know there's a whole lot there. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's a dynamic world. It's in lots of things in motion, but we're moving forward with this action plan, and we hope that's going to guide us at least through the end of the fiscal year and hopefully beyond.
Thanks, Mallory. And I might just add, if I can, that we do think that the South Atlantic LCC Steering Committee has demonstrated an interest in continuing to meet. So I think the South Atlantic LCC still exists. It's just that our staff role as Fish and Wildlife Service employees is changing, and we don't quite know what that role will be yet. Is that fair to add, Mallory?
Yeah, and I think, steering committee is an entity that is self-directed, and they can choose to meet however they want to. The guidance that we've received so far as Fish and Wildlife Service employees is we won't be providing the dedicated staff support to the governance and operations of the LCC any longer. So looking for that niche and developing that in an action plan, directing that at a southeast level is what we're focused on in the near term.
All right. So thanks for that update, Mallory.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions in the last 2 minutes of our call today?
Hey, Mallory, this is Ricky White with NatureServe. How are y'all doing?
Hey, Ricky.
Good.
Hey, I was curious about the continuing resolution versus the president's budget on this issue of LCC funding. Is it possible that the LCCs are going to be able to kind of continue on with the continuing resolution, or are there other things that are creating this changeover in terms of I guess priorities at the higher level and shifts in that?
Yeah, I think the real quick answer is probably some of both. In terms of the remainder of this fiscal year, so the federal year that'll run through the end of September, we expect, and I can't say with any certainty, but the continuing resolution will probably provide funding for us to continue on in certain ways. We're focusing that time on really developing and engaging with this action plan to position ourselves for really long-term continued success. Whether that comes in the form of a budget allocation is more questionable. Probably wouldn't even want to speak to that. We do know that we're not in the president's FY19 budget, so we got to finish out the remainder of fiscal 18 before we even get to that. So there's lots of uncertainty there. We have been told, at least in terms of employment, that Fish and Wildlife Service intends to utilize the staff and the capacity in the ways that I mentioned, focusing on those priority areas a little bit earlier. So
thanks.
It's that's kind of a non-answer, but it about the best I can do given the uncertainty of the landscape.
No, that's helpful. I was just curious what you thought.
Anybody else before we sign off? It's 11:01, so I don't want to keep anybody long. Well, thank you guys so much, and a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing their wisdom with us today. I took a lot of notes, some really good nuggets to continue to explore as we go through this transition, and I'll continue working together on our shared goals here in the Southeast. So really appreciate you guys being free with your time today, and as always, I'll post the recording and the slides on the South Atlantic LCC website, so you're welcome to check those out later. Thanks again, and hope to see you in March.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Hillary.